On December 24, 1944, Camp Dubois, Wyoming, lay buried beneath 3 feet of powder-white snow that muffled every sound. Inside the perimeter fence, 600 German prisoners huddled near pot-bellied stoves, their breath rising like smoke in the freezing dusk. The Americans patrolled in heavy parkas, rifles slung low, boots crunching over ice that cracked beneath each cautious step. At precisely 1800 hours, the mess hall doors swung open with a gust of warmth and roasted fragrance that stopped conversation mid-sentence. Lieutenant Harold Harlemert, his face ruddy from the kitchen's heat, announced that Christmas dinner would be served to all without exception. The prisoners expected thin soup and ration bread, the usual wartime fare that carried more duty than taste. Instead, long wooden tables shimmered beneath lantern light, heavy with platters of golden turkey, dressing, and steaming vegetables. Coffee urns hissed beside metal trays, stacked with pies that glistened beneath melted sugar. The announcement rippled through the barracks, disbelief mixing with hunger and silent awe, as men who once faced each other through guns now faced shared plates. Snow pressed against the windows as the orchestra of cutlery began, German hands trembling around utensils polished by American orderlies. For a brief moment, the Atlantic, the Ardennes, and the ideology of years seemed very far away. The guards watched, half smiling, as captured officers rose to offer thanks in halting English, their words cautious yet sincere. Outside, the flagpole clattered faintly in the wind, its metal chain striking rhythm to an unfamiliar peace settling over the camp. Somewhere beyond the timber ridge, artillery thundered on distant European fronts, but here, the noise existed only in memory. When the first carol rose, a hesitant German hymn joined by American voices, the mess hall became something unrecognizable to both sides. In that glow of shared warmth, beneath the truce of winter, the arithmetic of war dissolved into humanity's simplest equation: hunger met with mercy, and enmity answered by grace. Across the vast winter of 1944, the American continent became an unexpected frontier of quiet confinement and fragile reconciliation. From Maine's frozen pine forests to California's sunlit valleys, more than 425,000 Axis prisoners lived behind fences that seemed almost symbolic. Camp Dubois represented only one thread in a web of 155 base camps and 500 branch facilities scattered across 46 states. Vermont, North Dakota, and Nevada alone escaped the burden of captivity, their soil untouched by the paradox of housing an enemy with dignity. Each compound operated under Geneva Convention guidelines that Americans interpreted with a generosity exceeding military necessity. Barbed wire enclosed not cruelty, but administration, orderly kitchens, medical wards, libraries, and recreation fields where captured soldiers sought fragments of normality. The War Department's prisoner of war branch maintained meticulous records, ensuring that rations equaled those issued to U.S. personnel stationed domestically. Trucks arrived weekly from nearby depots carrying flour, coffee, canned meat, and seasonal fruit, their deliveries transforming enemy encampments into miniature reflections of American abundance. In Wyoming, the winter storms built fortresses of ice around wooden barracks, yet within, warmth persisted through routine. Guards rotated shifts every 6 hours, their orders emphasizing respect over retribution. Prisoners responded with disciplined precision that echoed the military structure they once served. Roll call sounded at dawn, followed by work assignments in forestry, road maintenance, or farm detail beyond the wire. By December, the contrast between battlefield devastation abroad and structured coexistence at home had become stark. Newspapers carried photographs of ruined European towns, while local columns mentioned POW choirs performing at Christmas services for nearby communities. Farmers who labored alongside German work details discovered efficient craftsmanship where they had expected arrogance. Captives found decency where they had imagined vengeance. In this vast geography of improbable civility, America transformed captivity into a lesson in democratic strength. The camps, built to contain enemies, instead revealed the nation's confidence to govern through fairness. Snow still buried Wyoming's fences, But the real barrier between foes had already begun to melt beneath the quiet rhythm of shared survival. When the transports first arrived from the Atlantic ports, the captured soldiers expected hostility carved from propaganda's darkest warnings. German officers, hardened by discipline and indoctrination, braced for humiliation, believing captivity in enemy hands meant degradation or starvation. Instead, they stepped onto American soil greeted not by rifle blows, but by administrative precision, vaccination lines, and orderly distribution of blankets. The irony deepened as former U-boat crews found themselves aboard luxury liners once marked for destruction, now ferrying them toward comfort that outshone their wartime privileges. Submarine Commander Hinrich Bluykrot recorded disbelief upon tasting hot coffee served by uniformed stewards aboard the Queen Mary, the same vessel his flotilla had tried to sink. Prisoners whispered among themselves that such treatment must conceal ulterior motives, yet weeks passed, and the courtesy remained consistent. From New Jersey rail depots to inland camps, guards carried sidearms but rarely raised their voices. The routines felt civilized, almost courteous, a discipline of democracy rather than domination. At Camp Dubois, Sergeant Rudolf Richel wrote in his diary that surrender had unexpectedly restored his sense of worth. The Americans treated him as a soldier who had lost a battle, not as an object of revenge. The barracks were heated, meals plentiful, medical staff attentive to wounds long ignored on the front. Even the smallest gestures, a guard sharing tobacco, a mechanic explaining engine maintenance, unraveled layers of fear built through years of indoctrination. The dissonance unsettled many who had believed themselves defenders of a superior civilization. They found that the enemy, rather than savage conquerors, embodied order without oppression. Every tray of food and every respectful command challenged narratives carried from the fatherland. The material abundance surrounding them became an indictment of everything they had been told about decadence and weakness. Captivity had become revelation, and surrender, paradoxically, began to feel like moral liberation. In the heart of enemy territory, they discovered that mercy, not power, defined the true victor of war. As evening settled over Camp Dubois, the bitter wind that scoured the plains carried scents of roasted meat and nutmeg. Inside the mess hall, warmth shimmered against frost-glazed windows while prisoners entered in cautious lines, eyes adjusting from darkness to a glow that seemed almost theatrical. The tables stretched in perfect symmetry, each marked by folded napkins, polished tin plates, and generous portions of turkey, potatoes, beans, and pies. For men who had survived winter campaigns on the Eastern Front, the sight carried the weight of an illusion too merciful to trust. Lieutenant Harold Harlemert stood beside the American flag, reading from a clipboard with military clarity as he announced the rations authorized by headquarters for the holiday meal. His voice, steady but compassionate, carried across the hall while guards leaned casually near doorways, their rifles unshouldered. He spoke not of victory, but of decency, reminding both sides that discipline without humanity meant defeat of a different kind. The prisoners listened in silence, hands trembling as they reached for food that felt undeserved yet profoundly human. Steam rose in gentle clouds as conversation began to ripple across the room, hesitant at first, then warm with recognition of shared existence. An American corporal described Wyoming's winters to a Bavarian machinist. A captured Luftwaffe pilot recounted his fascination with American aircraft production. Language barriers dissolved under gestures, laughter, and the universal rhythm of hunger satisfied. For every man in that room, the sound of cutlery against tin became a hymn to survival, unspoken but understood. Outside, searchlights swept across snowdrifts that glimmered like mirrors beneath the moon, guarding not prisoners, but the fragile peace momentarily born within. When a harmonica began playing Stille Nacht, voices rose uncertainly, blending German reverence with American harmony until the two became indistinguishable. In that instant, the boundary between captor and captive vanished, replaced by something purer than surrender, acknowledgement of shared mortality. Within barbed wire fences, where power once ruled by separation, a single meal accomplished what treaties could not. It reminded men that even amid total war, the human spirit remained undefeated. In the weeks following that extraordinary Christmas, the memory of shared warmth lingered like an ember beneath the monotony of routine. Camp Dubois resumed its rhythm of roll calls, work assignments, and evening curfews. Yet something intangible had changed within the wire. Prisoners who once moved in silent formation now carried faint smiles, their conversations stretching beyond obedience into recollections of humanity rekindled. Beneath the barrack lamps, they began writing letters, thin blue sheets covered in tight script, bound for a continent still drowning in ruin. Those letters, censored but unaltered in meaning, crossed the Atlantic through military postal channels, reaching families scattered across a devastated Reich. Wives and mothers read of warm meals, clean clothing, and unexpected kindness received from supposed adversaries. Many wept at the contradiction, finding comfort in the knowledge that their sons' captors behaved with honor unknown on battlefields consumed by vengeance. For the American guards who processed each envelope, the correspondence became an invisible bridge linking victory to conscience. The War Department encouraged this exchange, aware that every written page served as quiet propaganda, more powerful than leaflets dropped from aircraft. It demonstrated to the world that democracy's strength lay not merely in arsenals, but in restraint, fairness, and moral endurance. The prisoners' letters described orchards where they worked freely under minimal supervision, and classrooms where English lessons replaced ideology. They wrote of Lieutenant Harlemer's order that every man, regardless of rank, receive identical rations at Christmas, an act that echoed across thousands of miles as testimony of American character. By February 1945, even Red Cross observers noted a visible transformation in camp morale. The men who once saluted Hitler's portrait now debated philosophy, agriculture, and architecture beside American volunteers. Their pens continued shaping narratives that contradicted the iron dogmas they had once defended. Within those fragile envelopes, folded between ink and hope, traveled the quiet revolution of perspective. And while Europe still burned, the seeds of reconciliation were already germinating, nurtured not by diplomats or soldiers, but by ordinary men discovering that compassion could cross any border drawn by war. By the spring of 1945, the Wyoming snow melted into soft rivers that carried renewal through the camp's frozen soil. The prisoners of Camp Dubois were assigned forestry work along the Wind River Range, their labor contracted to nearby timber companies under strict supervision. Each morning, trucks rumbled beyond the wire, carrying men who had once commanded tanks or aircraft, now wielding axes and saws beneath endless pine canopies. What began as obligation slowly evolved into a rhythm of purpose, restoring dignity to lives once consumed by ideology. American overseers noted the precision of German workmanship, the quiet pride in tasks performed with soldierly efficiency. These labor details, initially conceived as economic necessity, became daily acts of mutual recognition. Local farmers invited work crews to share midday meals, and by habit rather than regulation, guards joined them at the same tables. Suspicion eroded through repetition, each hour of toil transforming captors and captives into laborers bound by common exhaustion. For many, the earth beneath Wyoming's skies became neutral ground where hatred lost its logic. Cultural exchange flourished in unexpected forms. The camp band, assembled from former military musicians, performed marches and folk tunes for townspeople on Sunday afternoons. In return, church choirs visited the compound, their hymns translated phonetically into German for communal services. Children from Dubois sent Christmas cards months late, their colored pencil drawings pinned proudly beside bunks, numbered with military precision. Within the boundaries of captivity, freedom redefined itself not as escape, but as understanding. Reports sent to Washington described declining disciplinary incidents and rising cooperation, attributing it to psychological stabilization through humane engagement. Behind bureaucratic phrasing lay a simpler truth. Respect had replaced resentment. Lieutenant Harlemert, whose Christmas order began this transformation, wrote in his diary that education, labor, and shared meals had achieved what interrogation never could: clarity about the futility of hatred. As the days lengthened and Europe neared surrender, the men at Camp Dubois no longer viewed their confinement as punishment, but as passage. Within those timbered hills, once isolated by snow and suspicion, they discovered the labor of redemption, a work measured not in hours, but in humanity reclaimed. By late April 1945, tension rippled quietly through Camp Dubois, like a distant storm heard beyond calm skies. Radio loudspeakers, once reserved for weather reports and music, began carrying bulletins that changed the prisoners' world forever. The Reich was collapsing, its cities shattered, its armies scattered across every front. In barracks thick with anticipation, men gathered around static-laden broadcasts, straining to recognize the names of towns they once defended and comrades now vanished. Silence followed each announcement, heavier than any order. Lieutenant Harlemert authorized access to verified news under close supervision, believing that truth, however painful, deserved acknowledgement. On May 2nd, the announcement arrived that Berlin had fallen, and by May 8th, official surrender confirmed what most already knew. The reactions within the camp defied uniformity. Some wept quietly, others stared at the floor in disbelief, and a few stood motionless, stripped of identity more than allegiance. The symbols that had defined them, uniforms, ranks, and anthems, suddenly belonged to history's ruins. For the guards, victory brought neither celebration nor vengeance. They watched the transformation with restrained empathy, understanding that these men, though once enemies, now carried the unbearable weight of a nation's moral collapse. Chaplains were dispatched to address gatherings in both languages, their sermons speaking of reconciliation, not triumph. A German officer who had commanded hundreds at Stalingrad asked to lead a prayer for peace. The Americans allowed it, standing silently among their former foes. Letters written after surrender bore a different tone, no longer describing comfort in captivity, but bewilderment at a homeland erased by war. Some prisoners begged to remain in America, fearing starvation or retribution if repatriated. Others resolved to return, determined to rebuild what ideology had destroyed. Through it all, Camp Dubois remained steady, a sanctuary for men learning to exist without orders or enemies. When the American flag and the newly whitewashed German one hung side by side at half-mast in May's soft wind, no one cheered. The war had ended, yet within the quiet Wyoming valley, the cost of belief, loyalty, and deception lay exposed, fragile, final, and profoundly human. Summer 1945 unfolded with deceptive tranquility across the plains of Wyoming, where Camp Dubois lingered between war's aftermath and uncertain peace. The once regimented routines now drifted into quieter hours, filled with introspection rather than orders. The prisoners, no longer bound by military identity, yet not entirely free, lived within a limbo defined by patience. Days began with roll calls conducted almost ceremonially, followed by voluntary work, repairing fences, tending vegetable gardens, and crafting wooden toys for local children. Rumors of repatriation moved through the camp like restless wind. Some men spoke eagerly of returning to their families and rebuilding shattered towns, while others dreaded facing a Germany reduced to rubble and guilt. The guards, too, sensed the slow dissolution of purpose. They had spent years enforcing boundaries that were now fading into memory, their vigilance replaced by reluctant friendship. Card games extended into twilight, and shared cigarettes replaced suspicion with familiarity. What had begun as captivity had transformed into community born from endurance. The War Department began logistical preparations for prisoner transfers, but transportation shortages and administrative delays stretched the process for months. During that suspended time, Camp Dubois became an unlikely classroom of democracy. Lectures on literature, engineering, and civic ethics were introduced by university instructors from Laramie, teaching through translators who bridged not only language but ideology. German officers debated politics without fear of reprisal, discovering liberty's quiet discipline through dialogue rather than command. In late August, a Red Cross inspection praised the camp as a model of humane reintegration. Yet beneath that commendation pulsed melancholy, for both captives and captors understood that their shared existence was nearing its end. Farewells began cautiously, handshakes, brief nods, unspoken gratitude heavy in the air. The fences still stood, but they no longer symbolized division. They merely marked a chapter closing with grace rather than resentment. As autumn approached and the first frost glazed the barrack roofs, Camp Dubois waited, neither prison nor refuge anymore, but a living monument to what mercy had accomplished when the world had forgotten how to forgive. In the cold dawn of November 1945, convoys of olive-drab trucks lined the perimeter of Camp Dubois under pale light. The first groups of German prisoners assembled in silence, their duffel bags packed with issued clothing, notebooks, and small carvings shaped from Wyoming pine. Snow flurries drifted through the wire fence like ghosts of the year before, reminding everyone how far time had carried them since that first Christmas feast. Guards checked rosters without haste, their expressions solemn, aware that departure meant farewell to men who no longer felt like enemies. For many prisoners, the prospect of returning home evoked unease deeper than anticipation. Reports from Europe spoke of starvation, dismantled cities, and occupation zones dividing the nation they once served. Some feared being branded traitors for surviving. Others dreaded confronting families altered by loss. Yet duty compelled them forward, each step toward the trucks a quiet act of courage amid uncertainty. Lieutenant Harlemert moved among the lines, shaking hands with men who had labored beside him for nearly a year. His final words carried no ceremony, only the quiet dignity of farewell between equals forged by circumstance rather than command. As engines rumbled to life, the camp loudspeaker played a simple melody chosen by the prisoners themselves, Stille Nacht, the same carol that had once joined both sides under candlelight. Its notes drifted across the snowy valley, echoing through watchtowers and empty barracks now stripped of purpose. Guards saluted the departing columns, rifles lowered in respect rather than authority. For a brief instant, the barbed wire shimmered in the morning light, like threads of silver rather than steel. When the last truck disappeared beyond the ridge, silence reclaimed Camp Dubois. Only footprints remained, fading into the frost as symbols of a reconciliation history seldom records. In that frozen stillness, the boundaries between conqueror and captive dissolved completely, leaving behind a testament not of victory or defeat, but of humanity rediscovered through the slow grace of understanding. Years later, long after the fences of Camp Dubois had been dismantled and its barracks surrendered to prairie grass, the story endured in fragments, letters, photographs, and recollections whispered at reunions across 2 continents. Former prisoners wrote to their American guards, exchanging Christmas cards and photographs of children who had grown up free of propaganda's inheritance. In Germany's new towns, rebuilt from ash and humility, many who had once eaten beneath those Wyoming rafters became teachers, engineers, or craftsmen dedicated to peace. They carried with them a quiet conviction born not of surrender, but of the decency shown by those who could have chosen revenge. Historians examining the archives found reports that defied wartime logic: low escape rates, minimal violence, and consistent goodwill within the prisoner population. The files spoke less of control than of cooperation, revealing that America's true victory lay not in conquest, but in moral restraint. Camp Dubois, once anonymous among hundreds, emerged as a symbol of what happens when humanity transcends the arithmetic of vengeance. Its Christmas dinner of 1944 became legend among former captives, a moment when the war's most unexpected truce unfolded far from any battlefield. Decades later, descendants of both sides visited the site, now marked only by a stone plaque weathered by wind and time. Standing beneath Wyoming's vast sky, they traced the outlines of where the mess hall once stood, imagining the warmth that filled it on that frozen night. The prairie wind carried faint echoes of harmonicas and laughter once shared between men divided by flags, but united by hunger and grace. In the great ledger of history, where wars are measured by battles and casualties, Camp Dubois occupies a quieter line. Proof that compassion can exist even when reason insists it should not. That winter, when enemies broke bread together and the snow sealed the world outside, humanity briefly conquered war itself. The legacy endures not in monuments or medals, but in remembrance, that mercy, offered in the heart of conflict, becomes the truest victory ever won.